So what we're going to do now is take a look at some examples of texts. Some of these were sort of assigned in the course reading. In fact, I included more than we'll have time to do in my suggested readings for this section. You'll see that I suggested looking at Judges and Samuel and Amos and Job and Proverbs and Psalms and the Book of Jonah, Song of Songs. So we'll talk about some of these, but we don't have time to get into all of those, just like we didn't get into all of the Torah readings either. And if you're really inspired, you can, there's actually a plan schedule where if you read a little bit every day, you can read through the whole Hebrew Bible in 1 year. So there is a plan out there to be able to do that if that is something you're motivated to do. But what I want to do now is actually switch what I'm sharing and go back to this one, because we have some examples of text that we can look at here. So here's some examples of, for example, prophetic literature. So here you have in the book of Isaiah, chapter 2. In the days to come, the mount of Yahweh's house shall stand firm above the mountains and tower above the hills, and all the nations shall gaze on it with joy. And the many people shall go and say, come, let us go to the mount of Yahweh, to the house of God of Jacob, that he will instruct us in his ways and we walk in his paths. And this is a famous phrase that's often sung in synagogues, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, for out of Zion shall come forth instruction, teaching, or Torah, the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. Thus he will judge among the nations and arbitrate for the many peoples. And this famous line, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up a sword against nation. They shall never again know war. So this is a kind of universal prophecy, right? That all the peoples will, all the nations will come and gaze on this mountain. And the people of Israel will be, it's still the God of Jacob, right? They're still in a privileged position, but it's sort of a universal appeal. Other prophecies are more focused on the house of Israel, on their behavior, on their rewards, and on their punishments for having gone astray. There's very colorful language used. They're described as having whored after other gods and been played the harlot, and the punishments they're promised will make their ears ring and so on. So we'll hear some examples of this in the book of Amos. Now, Amos is actually born in the south, but he's sent to prophesy in the north, in the kingdom of Israel, even though he's from Judah. And you'll see the reception he gets. So Amos announces, this is what he showed me. God was standing on a wall checked with a plumb line. A plumb line is how you make sure a wall is straight. It's actually a weighted line with some lead on it. And then that's the plumb is like from plumium. PB is the symbol for lead in the periodic table. So a leaded line hangs down straight, and you can check if the wall is straight. And God was holding a plumb line, or at least the image of a person holding a plumb line was shown to Amos. And Amos says, I see a plumb line. And God says, I'm going to apply a plumb line to my people Israel. I will pardon them no more. The shrines of Isaac will be laid waste, the sanctuaries of Israel reduced to ruins, and I will turn upon the house of Jeroboam with the sword. Now, the priests of the north are not so happy to hear that. That's not good news for them. So they then send to the king and say, listen to this. Amos, the prophet, is conspiring against you within the house of Israel. He said Jeroboam will die by the sword. And Amaziah, the priest, said to Amos, you visionary, you seer, go off to the land of Judah, earn your living there, but don't prophesy again at Bethel, for it is a king's sanctuary and a royal palace, you bumpkin. Get back to Judah. And Amos responds, I am not a prophet. I am not a prophet's disciple. This is not my job. It's not my profession. I'm not earning a living here. I'm a cattle breeder. I tend sycamore figs. But Yahweh took me away from following my flock. And Yahweh said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel. And so hear the word of Yahweh. You say I must not prophesy or preach about the heights of Isaac, but this is what I swear Yahweh said. Your wife will play the harlot in the town. Your sons and daughters will fall by the sword. Your land shall be divided up with a measuring line, not by ancestral claim, but by random lot, by someone else drawing a line on a map. You yourself shall die on unclean soil, for Israel shall be exiled from its soil. So you get a flavor of the prophetic condemnation and even conflict with society, because kings don't like to hear they're doing everything wrong. And so there's all kinds of stories in Ezekiel and in specifically in even in the books of Kings where prophets appear and they prophesy, like the prophet Elijah. Doesn't have his own book, by the way, you notice. But Elijah is a prophet during the books of Kings, telling the kings what they're doing wrong. And they don't like it, and they try to kill him, and he has to run away. And there's all kinds of dramatic scenes with the confrontations between the prophets of Yahweh and the prophets of other gods. Here's an example of some of the rhetoric you'll find in Psalms. This is in Psalm 22. Interesting note, you'll notice at the beginning, sometimes it will say, to the deer of the dawn, or to something else like that. And scholars speculate that that's actually like a popular melody, like to the tune of row, row, row your boat. That's why they have to the deer of the dawn. Otherwise, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And most of the Psalms are attributed to King David. By the way, I could have mentioned earlier, each of those Hebrew Bible books are attributed to somebody who lived before around the year 450 BCE. That's when prophecy ended, according to Jewish tradition. Malachi is seen as the last of the prophets. So anything that's claimed to be holy had to have been written before Malachi. That's why Daniel is set during the Babylonian exile, even though it was probably written several centuries after Malachi supposedly was written. This is, again, the attribution side. The book of Ecclesiastes is all Greek wisdom literature, but it's attributed to King Solomon because he was a wise king. So, again, it has to be predated to pass muster. So this is ascribed to King David. Who knows when it was written, but it was ascribed to King David. And you might not recognize the second verse here. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from delivering me and from my anguished roaring? My God, I cry by day, you answer not, by night, and I have no respite. Now that my God, why have you abandoned me or forsaken me is a line of Jesus on the cross. He's quoting Psalm 22, which is a psalm of, I'm suffering, please save me. I'm suffering. And there's other lines in this that sort of resonate with the Jesus story. I take count of my bones while they look on and gloat. They divide my garments among themselves, casting lots for my clothing. That's also described in one of the Gospels, describing. So again, this is the claim that the Old Testament prophesies the New, but Jesus was simply quoting a psalm that he knew that fit the moment. And he quoted it in Aramaic, by the way, in an Aramaic translation. But this is one of the styles of Psalms, is the lament. The, oh, woe is me, oh, I'm suffering, and oh, God, please save me, please save me. And then there are also Psalms of gratitude, like Psalm 23, which you've probably heard many, many times. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. This is the King James Version, but you have another version here. The idea is God does wonderful things for me. You spread a table for me in view of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my drink is abundant. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Only goodness and steadfast love shall pursue me all the days of my life. So a book of pious believing. Now, Ecclesiastes goes in a very different direction. Ecclesiastes takes the perspective, there's nothing new under the sun. And all has been in some ways predetermined, and it doesn't really matter how much you do. There's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to rise up and a time to lie down. I mean, this is the song Turn, Turn, Turn by the Byrds, but it's originally almost a pessimistic Hellenistic view of life, that it doesn't matter. I mean, look at what it says in chapter 9 here. The same fate is in store for all, for the righteous and for the wicked, for the good and the pure and for the impure, for him who sacrifices and him who does not. That is the sad thing. The same fate is in store for all. He who is reckoned among the living is something to look forward to. Even a live dog is better than a dead lion, since the living know they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more recompense, for even the memory of them has died. Their loves, their hates, their jealousies have long since perished. Go, eat your bread in gladness, and drink your wine in joy, for your action was long ago approved by God. This is like the long-term plan. Let your clothes be washed and your head never lack ointment. Enjoy happiness with the woman you love all the fleeting days of your life that have been granted you under the sun, all your fleeting days. For that alone is what you can get out of life and out of the means you acquire under the sun. Whatever is in your power to do, do with all your might. For there is no action, no reasoning, no learning, no wisdom in Sheol, the underworld, where you are going. That's very, Epicurean, very Hellenistic. So question in the chat box, why is Psalm 23 said at funerals? It sounds like an afterlife. Well, sure it does. It's said at religious funerals where people believe in an afterlife. And as we've talked about before, Jews do believe in an afterlife. If you read rabbinic literature, we'll talk about that more next time, but they clearly talk about a world to come and a resurrection of the dead. And that's very much a part of Jewish theology in a pre-modern and in a current Orthodox setting. So reciting the Psalm of David is not contradictory at all, because it does sound a bit like an afterlife, or that God provides comfort to the living. I think in many ways people think of it as applying to the people who are still alive, that they'll receive some comfort from God, not just that this is applying to a paradise in the afterworld. Now, Song of Songs has a very different flavor to it. From both Ecclesiastes with his old depression, the theory is that Song of Songs was also written by Solomon, but when Solomon was young and had 100, had 100 wives. The Book of Proverbs was written when Solomon was old and mature and wise, and Book of Ecclesiastes was written when he was even older and bitter and sort of depressed about life. But Song of Songs definitely has a very different feel to it than either Ecclesiastes or the Book of Psalms. Ah, you are fair, my darling. Ah, you are fair. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats streaming down Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of ewes climbing up from the washing pool. All of them bear twins, and not one loses her young. You have no holes, right? They're all there. Your lips are like a crimson thread. Your mouth is lovely. Your neck is like the Tower of David. Your breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle. When the day blows gently and the shadows flee, I will betake myself to the Mount of Myrrh, the hill of frankincense. Any guess what that is? Every part of you is fair, my darling. There is no blemish in you. And so on and so on. I mean, this is very ribald stuff, right, for a Bible? But it reflects that folk literature, that love literature. Now, how do the rabbis make sense of this? Well, the rabbinic perspective is the Song of Songs is about the love between Israel and God. And the two breasts are like the tablets of the Ten Commandments, or Moses and Aaron standing next to each other, or some other, allegorical explanation. But I mean, it works better if you read it to your, to your sweetheart. I think it still has some nice stuff to it. So we'll look at just a couple other examples of this biblical literature, and then we'll talk about some general questions and ask if you have any as well. So let me take us back to this one. So here's a selection from the Book of Judges. And again, this is describing the Hebrew origins, but in a very different way. The Joshua story says there was a massive conquest that happened right away. This version is much more complicated. The Israelites did what was wrong in the face of Yahweh, and Ehud, the previous judge, is now dead. And so Yahweh surrendered them to King Yavin of Canaan, who reigned. His army commander was Sisera. And the Israelites cried out to Yahweh because he oppressed Israel for 20 years. Now, Deborah was an Isha Neviah. She was a woman of prophecy. And she led Israel at that time. And when it says to lead, it was shofta. She judged. Because a shofet, the judge, is really more of a kind of chieftain. But here's an episode where a woman is actually the lead figure in this Israelite confederation. She sat under a place called the Palm of Deborah in the hill country of Ephraim, and they would come to her for decisions. And she summoned Barak and said to him, Yahweh has commanded, go march up to Mount Tabor, take 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun. These are two tribes, not all the tribes, but just two of the tribes. And I will draw Sisera there in the Wadi Kishon. I will deliver him into your hands. And Barak says, if you go with me, I'll go. But if not, I'm not going. So he doesn't have a lot of nerve without the prophetess, the judge, going with him. So she says, okay, fine, I'll go with you. However, there'll be no glory for you in this, because Yahweh will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. And so he mustered up the armies. She went up with him. Sisera orders his chariots into the Wadi Kishon, and now is the day to attack. And a wadi is like a low valley, so they get to charge down the mountain. They have the high ground, and it throws the chariots into a panic, and they flee. All of Sisera's soldiers fell by the sword, and he flees. Sisera winds up at the tent of Yael from the Kenites, which is thought to be a safe place for him. And she feeds him some milk, and he falls into a deep sleep. And she takes a tent pin, and with the hammer, she drives the tent pin through his temple into the ground and nails his head to the ground, and thus kills him. When Barak appears, Yael greets him and shows him Sisera lying dead with a pin in his temple. and thus is the victory. He is killed not by Barak, but by a woman, in this case by Yael, not by Deborah, but Deborah still gets the credit. And then finally, in chapter 5, they sing. And this Song of Deborah is thought to be one of the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible because of the vocabulary used and the style of writing. You also see, by the way, some of the style of biblical poetry, where it rhymes not by sound, but by meaning. So here you have, for example, in verse 4, O Lord, when you came forth from Seir, advanced from the country of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens dripped, yes, the clouds dripped water. So notice how the first line, O Lord, when you came forth from Seir, advanced from the country of Edom. So it's saying the same thing twice, but with a little different details. The earth trembled, the heavens dripped, the clouds dripped water. So again, the heavens dripped, the clouds dripped water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, him of Sinai before the Lord God of Israel. Again, that double naming there. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anat, in the days of Yael, caravan ceased, and wayfarers went by roundabout paths. Again, you've got these two metaphors being used there. So that's a flavor of the both biblical poetry, but also of the stories told in the book of Judges, which is about, again, daring do and exciting in battles and a lot of action, not a lot of laws like you have in the Torah. The same is doubly true in the book of Samuel, which one scholar recently wrote a book about the book of Samuel as a marvelous textbook in politics. And it really is a fascinating read to see the book of Samuel look through that lens of political maneuvering. And this chapter is highlighted as one of the major examples of this. So in Samuel 11, David should be out leading his troops in battle. It was the season when the kings go out to battle. David sent his general Joab with his officers and all of Israel. They devastated Ammon, they besieged Rabbah, and then the last line is, David Yoshev Yerushalayim. And David was sitting in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, he rose from his couch, strolling on his roof, and he saw a woman bathing. She was very beautiful. He sent someone to ask about her, and he was told she is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite. So she's a Hebrew married to a Hittite who is serving in the army. And so the messengers fetched her. She came to him. He lay with her. It was just after her period. And she went back home and she conceived and she sent word to David, I am pregnant. So now David has a problem because all the men are at the front and he's the one at home. So he sends Yoav a message, quick, send Uriah home right away. So Uriah comes home. David asked him, how's Joab and how are the troops and how's the war? So this is the cover story, right? I need a report from the front. What's your report? Once the report is done, he says, okay, now go to your house and bathe your feet. And by the way, feet or legs is sometimes a euphemism for genitalia in biblical literature, just as if you wanted to make it more explicit. And when he left the royal palace, a present from the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the royal palace, along with the other officers. He did not go down to his house. And when David said, you've ruined it. You're supposed to go home and see your wife. You just came from a journey. Why didn't you go down to your house? Uriah said, the ark and Israel and Judah are at Sukkot. They're in temporary housing out there. And my master Yoav are camped in the open. How should I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As you live, by your very life, I will not do this thing. What kind of a jerk would go sleep with a woman when the men are in the field? David said to Uriah, stay here today also. Tomorrow I'll send you off. And so then David ate and drank with him until he got him drunk. So he started, well, maybe I'll get him drunk and that'll work. But he went out and slept in the same place, did not go down to his home. David said, well, got to try something else. He wrote a letter to Joab, which he sent with Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, put Uriah in the front lines where the fighting is fiercest, and then fall back so he will be killed. So when Joab was besieging the city, he stationed Uriah at the point where he knew there were able warriors, where the battle was hot. The men of the city sallied out and attacked Joab, and some of David's officers among the troops fell, and Uriah also died. And Joab sent a full report of the battle to David. He instructed the messenger as follows. Joab is no idiot either. He's very clever. When you finish reporting to the king about the battle, the king may get angry and say, why did you come so close to the city and attack it? Didn't you know they would shoot down from the wall? Stupid. What are you doing coming up to a wall? Wait for them to come out. Who struck down? Abimelech, son of Yerubbasheth? Wasn't it a woman who dropped a millstone from the wall? Why did you get so close to the wall? Why have so many casualties? And then you say, your servant Uriah the Hittite was among those killed. See, the message David sent to Joab said, make Uriah get killed. But war doesn't work that way. You don't just kill one person. And so Joab says, highlight to the king that he caused a lot of people to die. But if he gets mad, defend yourself by saying, by the way, Uriah is also dead, and I know something about Uriah. Like there's an implication there. So the messenger set out. He told David all that Joab said. Also, Uriah the Hittite fell. He decides not to wait for David to get mad. He just says it right away. Says, why risk it? And David said to the messenger, give Joab the message. Do not be distressed about the matter. The sword always takes his toll. This is actually a phrase in Hebrew. Ki chazeh v'chazeh tochal hacherem. Because thus and so consumes the sword. That's life. That's life and death in the big city. That's how wars go. Oh, well. Press your attack on the city and destroy it. Uriah's wife heard her husband was dead. She lamented over her husband. And after the period of mourning was over, David sent and had her brought into his palace. She became his wife and bore him a son. But Yahweh was mad. And he sent the prophet Nathan to David. And Nathan tells David a story. There were two men in the same city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had very large flocks and herds, but the poor man had only one little ewe lamb he had bought. And so a traveler came to the rich man, but he didn't want to take him to his own flocks. And so he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who would come to him. And David got mad and said, that man should die. Nathan said to David, that man is you. Didn't get it. People are really dense about, metaphors and parables because they just don't get it. Yahweh says, I anointed you king over Israel. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives. I would have given you twice as much. And then you put Uriah to the sword. You took his wife and him killed by the Ammonites. Therefore, the sword will never depart from your house. You will be fighting wars your whole life. A calamity will rise up against you within your own house. And this actually happens later in the book of Samuel. David confesses, I am guilty before the Lord, and the child is afflicted that was born to David, but the child dies. There's nothing they can do on the seventh day. And he rose from the ground. He anointed himself and changed his clothes. He bowed down and prostrated himself, asked for food, and then he ate. Courtiers are now confused. Why have you acted like this? When the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that he's dead, you rise and take food? He said, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept because who knows? The Lord might have pity on me. But now that he's dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back to me? I shall go to him, but he will never come back to me. He consoled his wife Bathsheba and lay with her, and she bore him a son named Solomon, who would be favored and ultimately would become the next king. But you have this marvelous drama of political intrigue and secret messages and affairs and illegitimate children and divine punishment and parables and prophets. It's really dramatic stuff. And this is why when people spend their time going over and over again, Torah, 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 Torah all the time, they're missing out on all this great stuff. That's also part of the canon of the most important books that the rabbis thought should be preserved 2,000 years ago. Obviously, we've written more since then. But this original stuff is our founding mythology and our founding literature. And they're just references that cannot be imbued with the same kind of resonance. So if you said, my son, why have you, I would that I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. It's the reason why Faulkner named his book, Oh, Absalom. Or they were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions, which is David's lament over Jonathan and Saul when they died in the field of battle. It just has resonance. You can't even listen to the Leonard Cohen song Hallelujah, which talks about David singing, right? And you won't get it if you don't read the originals. You want to get the jokes? You got to know the original sources as literature, as stories. It doesn't have to be any kind of miraculous revelation from our perspective. Well, there's a lot more we could go into. We're already at an hour on the class time. We could talk about the book of Jonah, which is a kind of parody of a prophetic book, because normally when the prophet gets the call, he hears the call of God, he goes right to the city and he prophesies at great length and nobody listens. What happens in the book of Jonah is the opposite all the way around. Jonah gets the call to go to a non-Jewish city of Nineveh, which is like the hotbed of the Assyrians that killed the northern kingdom entirely. And he runs the other direction. He goes down to the seaside and he gets on a boat and sails away and goes down to the bottom of the boat to fall asleep. And then he gets thrown overboard and gets swallowed by a fish and is sitting on the bottom of the ocean. And finally he says, oh, you're right, God, I was wrong. I should have done it all along. And bleh, it spits him up on the ground. And then he goes to Nineveh and he stands in the center of the city and he says, in 3 days, Nineveh falls. That's all he says. That's it. And they listen. The king, the courtiers, they all put on sackcloth and ashes and fast. They even put sackcloth and ashes and make the cows fast. Like everybody, everything in town is lamenting, and God forgives them because they listened. And Jonah gets mad because now he looks like an idiot. He said, Nineveh's going to fall in 3 days. He didn't say unless. There was no unless. It was supposed to fall in 3 days. So then God makes a plant grow over him to provide him some shade. And he enjoys the shade. And then he makes the sun beat down so hard it kills the plant, it withers, and Jonah gets heat stroke. And God says, well, what do you think now, huh? Jonah says, ugh, this is hurting me so much, I wish I would die. And God says, you're lamenting that plant that was born and died in a day, and I shouldn't have any mercy on Nineveh, which is a city of thousands of people, and also a lot of cows. That's the end of the book, period. A lot of cows is the last line of the book. So, I mean, it's not read as parody in traditional rabbinic thought. In fact, it's assigned to be read on Yom Kippur, because the message is it's not too late. Even the wicked empire of Nineveh could repent and be forgiven. So on Yom Kippur afternoon is your last chance, but it's still possible. But it reads to me much more like a parody of a prophetic book because of all those quirky, funny details to it. We can also look at the book of Job, great example of what's called theodicy, that question of why bad things happen to good people. The book of Ruth is really fascinating on its stories of women and their attempt to negotiate a system that is not set up for their favor. But again, this is a large canon, right? If it takes you a year to read the Torah, it's going to take you longer to read the Hebrew Bible if you're reading it for detail and nuance and story and commentary. It's a bottomless well. But it's the first collection of Jewish literature that's worth noting, even if we use it for history in different ways than our ancestors did. And we don't accept it as divinely revealed. It's written by people. But the flip side is, if it's written by people, then it's accessible literature. And that makes it interesting. And when we agree with something our ancestors wrote 2,000 years ago, that makes us feel good. That they were onto something. That's true up to now. There are other things they wrote that we might decide we don't agree with anymore, but that's okay too. And some of the human stories they're telling of love and jealousy and hatred, those are part of the human condition, and their insights still apply to our experience. So let me stop there and ask if there are any questions or comments before we look at a couple of the curriculum discussion questions.
So as you know, I've been reading this for a while. I'm at Jeremiah 40. That's where I read tonight, which is just after the fall of Jerusalem. And
no, are you reading a Hebrew Bible or a?
I'm reading the Jewish Study Bible.
Okay, so you've got the Tanakh order, not the Old Testament order.
Right, I've got the Tanakh order, so I'm reading it in the right order. What I get confused, well, from the Jewish standpoint, what I get confused of is, as a historian, I'm reading a lot of history. But it doesn't always mesh. You know, that there's different versions of things. Even just now, for example, Jeremiah, you know, first he's released in Jerusalem and do what he wants, but then right in the next chapter it says no, he was taken away in shackles with the rest of the exiles, and then he was released. You know, and where I have difficulty is not the fact that there's discrepancies within the readings, because it's written by different people and sometimes even at different times, or it was edited several stories of the same thing and then try to fit it together. But how do you rationalize that with making all of this sacred? Well, because there's so many contradictions within it, and some of it is just plain flat out. I mean, like numbers. It's just like a description of how you build a tabernacle. I
Look,
mean, why is
Lori,
this? Yeah.
you need to use your imagination.
Okay.
You are reading on the surface level,
Yeah.
what's called a pshat, the simple surface level.
Okay.
But because God wrote this, there is so much more to this text than the simple surface level of information. I mean, why would you assume it's only about building a tabernacle? Maybe it's about building the tabernacle in your soul. Maybe it's about the structure of the universe if you read the things correctly. Maybe it's a narrative like the Exodus is not a wandering in the desert. It's a wandering of the spirit after death on its way to the afterlife. Right? Who knows? I mean, you could read all kinds of things into it. If you assume it has supernatural resonance to it, then you're going to read it that way. So, like the Song of Songs interpretation is just one example, reading that as an allegory for God's love for Israel, when it seems explicitly sexual in my reading of it, of the meaning of the literal meaning of the words. Never underestimate the power of religious people to make something mean what they want it to mean. Okay? That applies to constitutional thought too. And legal interpretation too.
Yeah, no, that's true. I guess I just don't have enough imagination with this at the moment. Maybe sometime.
Well, see, this is the tricky part about this, because it's not quite history, it's not quite literature, it's not quite ethics, it's not quite a law book. It's a mishmash of all kinds of different genres and ideologies. In fact, Jack Miles wrote a book called God, a Biography. And he says, if you try to take the God of this Hebrew Bible as one character, it's like a split personality. Who knows what? It changes his mind. It has different names. And it's all over the place. The historical approach to the text might make more sense. But the flip side is God as a character, I think, is more interesting. When you see the anger management issues and you see the vacillation and you see the jealousy and you see, that's very human. We make God in our image, and then it makes more sense.
Well, I have to say that, especially reading through Jeremiah, and God's pissed a lot, but I mean, obviously this is a way to explain why Judah, why Israel disappears to the Assyrians, and why Judah and Jerusalem, which is never supposed to be destroyed, is destroyed. Yeah, so you got to come up with some explanation.
You got to find justification after the fact.
Right.
So you got to make a long list of charges of all the things you did wrong. And it might not hurt if you also have some people who warned you were doing it wrong and you ignored them. Right. So that makes it even worse. The other thing that you find when you read these books carefully, as you're doing, is you find all these phrases and details and motifs that appear in Western literature that you never knew came from the Bible, right? Like knowing that my God, why have you forsaken me is from Psalms and not original to Jesus. Or there's all kinds of phrases that appear in the King James Bible for the first time that we never realize are part of it. Spare the rod, spoil the child, that's in Proverbs, and so on. Or even the motif we read in our story in David today. Can you think of another example in European literature where someone is sent with a letter that contains their own death and destruction, just like Uriah is sent to the front with the letter to Joab?
Going right back to the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern you were talking about earlier.
That's right. In Hamlet, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have a letter that says, kill the people who bear this letter. Now, I don't know if he's explicitly calling back to Uriah. There's a sort of dramatic, irony to that anyways, but it's an interesting resonance that you wouldn't get if you didn't read the original.
Oh, I think Shakespeare has a lot of motifs that he takes, but I think that's not untypical,
right.
Especially a lot of the morality stuff within it comes out of the Bible.
For sure. And, this is the foundation of Western literature. It's a foundation of Hebrew and modern Jewish literature too, but it's a core foundation to Western literature. And again, Jews forget that the Christian Bible isn't just the New Testament.
Right.
It includes the Old Testament. So all that wonderful European art often includes a lot of scenes from the Hebrew Bible, and the Book of Maccabees and the Book of Tobit and the Book of Judith. I mean, Judith is a Jewish heroine who like beheads a Greek general and does this stuff. And there's a famous artwork by a woman artist of Judith cutting off the head, and you get the sense that she actually herself, I guess, had been raped at one point, and so it's sort of a revenge fantasy for her. But you can feel the anger of the woman cutting the throat of the guy in the picture. It's a Jewish story being done by a Christian artist in medieval Europe. So we can find wonderful examples of these stories put into other forms because they were part of literature. One like random reference, I don't know why I remember this one, but it just jumped out at me. In the movie The Untouchables, one of the characters is this Irish policeman played by Sean Connery. And at one point he says, "We need to hang him higher than Haman." And when I first heard that, I thought, what? What is he doing talking about Purim? But then I remembered, oh, it's in the Catholic Bible, the story of Esther, and hang him higher than, sure, they would know they would know about that. So, that's one of those cases where it's not just ours anymore. It's part of world culture too. So I want to just look at a couple of the discussion questions. So the first one was, what is the difference between seeing the Bible as the book and seeing the Bible as the books? And of what use is a canon historically and in modern times? So what's the difference between the book versus the books?
Well, I mean, I think that when you look at it as books, it becomes clear that they're written at different times with different purposes.
Okay.
I also think it's interesting that it suggests that there are some that were left out. They were books. The books were chosen to be part of the canon instead of sort of like, here's the 5 books, boom, and we give you
the only 5 books ever.
Yeah, we found them in the back of the temple, and here they are.
Right. Also, calling it a canon has. Oh, sorry, James, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and also, when you're like thinking of it as the books, it also kind of highlights the fact that they're not all necessarily going to have the same point of view. For instance, the Book of Ruth has a very different point of view than like Ezra and Nehemiah when it comes to intermarriage.
Right. Also, if you put it into one volume, it's easier to imagine it has one author, right? Because it's all in one place. And there's a rabbinic saying, there's no early and late in Torah. By that, they mean scripture. So you could use something from, the David saga to explain something happening with Abraham, because it doesn't matter. It's all, at one moment in God's mind. But that's easier when you think of it as one canon, than as multiple books and multiple scrolls. The other thing that's valuable about a concept of a canon is it defines what your most important literature is. Right? This is the most important. We might have other stuff too, but once you have a canon, this is like the core sources to define who we are. And there's some debate actually about that Dead Sea Scrolls community over what their real canon was, because there are 3 kinds of books that you find there. You find books of the Hebrew Bible, you find other books written by Jews and circulating in Jewish life that we find evidence of elsewhere, and some things that were only written in the Dead Sea Scrolls community. So they're only found there and apply to life there. So the question is, what was their core canon and what was their supplementary canon? We can imagine the Hebrew Bible was the core canon, but maybe some of those other books, maybe they had a sort of Septuagint-y, floaty, canon that was not quite hardened yet. Maybe they would consider some of their own writings to be canonical, even if it was only for that community and not for anywhere else. Now, with no central Jewish authority today, there's no way to canonize Philip Roth or Dara Horn or any other modern Jewish writers as someone that every Jew has to read. This is what we got. And even as we'll see, rabbinic literature didn't get universally accepted. There was a whole group called the Karaites who rejected it. But even the Karaites and the Rabbinites agreed on the Hebrew Bible. There are some offshoots of Jewish life that have slightly different canons. The Ethiopian Jews, for example, have a somewhat different canon. The Jews in Yemen have the Tanakh, but not some other pieces. So, there are variations, but in general, the Tanakh is the universal Jewish canon, even among secular Jews. And in Israel, it became a core part of the curriculum, even for the secular school system, because they said this is the foundation of our language and literature and our time here on this land. And so we need to base ourselves on that. Now, number 3, what positive lessons could secular humanistic Jews teach from the story of David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel?
It's not a nice thing to do to go ahead and use your position of power to murder someone because you think his wife's hot and then take his wife as your new wife to add to your harem.
Okay, that's a very literal reading, but yes, don't do that. Maybe more generally, power corrupts. Okay. Even great heroes can have major flaws.
Yeah, I think that I'm not sure that the person that put that together wasn't thinking that, but it does suggest, I mean, I've always thought that nobody could be perfect in the Bible except God. So David is very close. He does all these great things, but here's a story that's sort of stuck in there and is a bad thing for him. And so he clearly has a weakness, which makes him not perfect and not divine in that sense.
Yeah. One of the chats commented that it becomes the basis for other great things like great music and stories. Even absolute loyalty, like Uriah is the hero in some ways of this because he's so loyal he won't even go sleep with his wife when he's home from the military service. But even that can be betrayed. In fact, blind loyalty may be not wise either. How about the importance of standing up to evil authority, like Nathan does, right? Nathan goes to David and says, you were wrong. He has to do it delicately, right? The parable and the story, but he stands up to David and says, you were wrong. And David has to take it.
Also, I think just the fact that the lesson that just because you have the power to do something doesn't mean that it's a good thing for you to do is not necessarily always apparent to humans. And it's a good thing to point out that the power to do something does not make it morally okay. Getting away with it does not make it morally okay.
Right. Well, he doesn't necessarily get away with it because the child dies, but still, David gets away with it, right? Except he has to suffer and he has his wives taken from him and there's other consequences he deals with. I'll also point out that sometimes people don't notice they're doing something wrong until someone else tells them, right? Like it takes Nathan to point out that David has done something really, really bad using that parable. I mean, we don't know if David's tormented at night, but maybe he is. It also points out, by the way, that sex has always been a powerful motivating force in human behavior, right? This is not new. This is not old. This is who we are. And it's also worth noting at the end of the story that sometimes your public responsibility takes precedence over your private emotions. David says, I have to stop mourning now. It's time to move forward. Sometimes that's part of our work as well. So the last question, are the texts of Proverbs, Job, or Ecclesiastes consistent with secular humanistic Judaism? We could argue yes, they are, and no, they're not. So what would be some arguments on either side? Either yes, they are, or no, they're not. What do you think?
I mean, I'd say that there are bits of each of them that are, and then bits of them that aren't. I mean, there are definitely good proverbs that are like, yeah, those are good proverbs. And then there are proverbs that are like, no, that's a horrible rule of thumb. Ignore that. And sort of the same thing about parts of Job and Ecclesiastes as well.
Okay.
I mean, part of Ecclesiastes is with, almost this life is all you have, make the best of it. Those are all good humanistic kind of things. There are little parts about, God having the power and all that, and some of the sort of almost depressingness of parts of it, not necessarily as great. So yeah, I think they're all just a mixed bag. Job probably the most irrelevant, I think.
Well, it's interesting because we're not going to find, a modern secular philosopher in the Hebrew Bible, because even in Greek thought, Epicurus, who was about as heretical as you get, still talks about the gods, right? But for him, the gods are so remote, they're almost indifferent. They're irrelevant. And in some ways, the God of Ecclesiastes is like the one who designs things before and just winds it up and lets it run, and is not intervening, and is not rewarding, is not punishing. And it's like the Big Bang. It's like the first domino flip, And so that kind of God is not that different from a humanistic approach to life. So it's not that far from us to read Ecclesiastes, or to some extent even Job, where God says, basically, who do you think you are? What do you know about the universe? He doesn't say, I'm wrong. He doesn't say, you're right. But he does sort of concede, this isn't designed for your benefit. This is not structured around what you think is right. And that's a major concession. So it's not humanistic like capital H, but it could be seen as an evolutionary ancestor, sort of like Homo erectus or Homo habilis are not identical to modern humanity, but they have some features that are similar. They're more erect, they have a little bit bigger head, and their pelvises are organized differently, and their hands they make more tools. And well, so they're a step in that direction. So I see books like Proverbs, Job, in their emphasis on understanding the world and studying the natural world to learn something about the human condition, questioning divine justice, focusing on life here and now. These are all features that we have in common with them. And if some of the vocabulary choices are different and their conceptual structuring of the universe is different, well, that's not unheard of and not inconceivable given the time distance and the knowledge limitations they had in their time and place. So that's a very quick overview, again, in a short time period for the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. And next time, we're going to turn to talk about rabbinic literature, because after all, just because you close a canon doesn't mean you stop thinking and you don't have more things to say, whether it's new ideas or new things to say about the old books. Well, rabbinic literature is going to include both of those. It will even include examples of what you're supposed to say to God now that God stopped talking to you. You no longer have new revelation. Now we need to have some kind of definition of what God wants from us and what he wants us to say when we talk to him. And that's the beginning of both a religious law, halakha, and a religious prayer system, or a siddur, a prayer book. So we'll talk more about those in our next session.